lights are going to be turned down, and I may shed my clothes as it gets, it gets hot. But I want to thank you, Carol, in whom I am in awe. This woman did this whole thing. I mean, and I watched her do it, and it is unbelievable what she has done. And I'm so proud of you. But really, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here this evening, and thank you all for coming out. Now, I typically don't assume that anyone is inherently, fascinated by a history of recent public art in New York, or at least maybe I wouldn't have until 6 months ago. Although everybody should be, and I hope that my book explains why. So my approach to my work, I think, has instructive lessons to offer those interested in statues, monuments, and public art in general, and in the debates about public art that have been roiling cities of late. My focus is New York City, always has been, but I would take a similar approach to the subject were I working on Richmond, Charlottesville, San Francisco, or anywhere USA. But paradoxically, my agenda is to show that place really matters. Embracing that take, I now appear to have something of an outlier position on monuments and public art that is grounded in actual research, analysis, and expertise, 30 years worth, and derives from the particular approach to the study of public sculpture history that I've taken for all this time. So I'm assuming
It's down there, so.
Oh. In telling you about sculpture in Gotham, I want to point to how the details of process matter as markers of social values and individual and group action that shape the built environment and its historical meanings over time. Public art objects were the culmination of social actions and are embodiments of them, of history and memory, which are kind of threatened with erasure. And each work reveals something of historical consequence. By telling you something of how and why public art came to be such an important presence in the post-war New York City public realm, and in particular about the circumstances in which the city of New York came actively to embrace a role as public art patron way back when. I hope in this book to impress upon you that such works and the circumstances are of inherent interest for multiple reasons. These reasons extend, I would argue, far beyond the kinds of sweeping and rather simplistic categorizations that have led many people to dismiss them and to, first of all, privilege gallery painting for some time, and then in the recent present with Confederate monuments and now the monument to J. Marion Sims, to call for and then achieve removal. I want to argue for taking individual works and their full context of production very seriously, and to argue for going beyond the cynical, dismissive, and presentist outlooks that many in the present day bring to older works. And by older, I mean 100 years old, which is not really what this book is about. So Sculpture in Gotham, my book, builds upon research on public sculpture and the material culture of the built environment that I've been doing for a long time. My earliest work looked at public sculpture, like works like Civic Virtue, like this, looked at it sociologically as the culmination of a process that had to be understood in relation to changing institutional and organizational structures. So different types of organizations, different sort of larger institutional frameworks, as well as struggles over professional authority. So who kind of has the power to do what? Work on the Art Commission of the City of New York in a subsequent book extended this inquiry, focusing on the activities of one powerful cohort, which is now an agency within the mayor's office, that was responsible, and still is, for approving all aspects of the built environment on city property. I've long tried to show that, how public art is nothing to be taken for granted, that it is where it is because certain individuals and groups worked hard to put it there. My research explored who exactly these individuals were, the kinds of professional and political agendas that they had, and the broader and often fractious politics that motivated patronage, process, and artistic decisions. In other words, the stuff of life itself. Sculpture in Gotham traces the rise of municipal government engagement with public sculpture as urban renewal and community affirmation. The range of people, institutional structures, and the complexity involved in this enterprise, the complicated efforts that were fundamentally dedicated and well-meaning. I'll introduce you briefly to the book's focus, overall focus and argument, but I'm going to focus in particular on my last chapter, which is on the recent, relatively recent public art processes that played out in Harlem. We think of New York City, or at least New Yorkers like to think of the city, as a hotbed of cutting-edge art. You see a lot of that at Rockefeller Center, for example. But in fact, some of the municipality's most significant successes from a social point of view lie elsewhere. I argue that New York City government helped to play a decisive role in introducing the general public to minimalism and other avant-garde styles championed by the establishment art world. But that in many ways, its most significant contribution and the most notable and representative development in permanent public art on municipal property were figurative hero statues, a tradition that many academics have ignored or maligned as outmoded. I want to highlight that these works are indicative of current trends and need to be examined. Now, let's step back a bit. New York City, after World War II, was not a public sculpture destination. Statues and monuments like the main memorial, which was completed in 1913, statues and monuments had flourished at the turn of the 20th century, but had declined markedly in number during the Depression and then Second World War. Figurative monuments like these became discredited as retardataire and disingenuous. And this is on the side of the civil courthouse by a very well-known sculptor, William Zorach. I'm sure most of you haven't seen it, but it's there. Some veterans and neighborhood groups attempted, after World War II, to erect war memorials. But interorganizational dissension, resistance from the city's art commission, and from the highly powerful Commissioner of Parks, Robert Moses, meant that little went forward. Moses disliked most public sculpture, as seen, for example, in a mocking two-part New York Times article that he wrote in 1943. Basically, Moses preferred sort of figurative styles with angular silhouettes, rough modeling, and kind of muddy brown patinas or coloring. When offered sculptural gifts for New York City Parks property, Moses selected those, and of course Moses was Parks Commissioner and kind of in power from 1933 to basically early 1960s, so a long time. When offered gifts for New York City property, Moses selected those that would appeal primarily to children, such as Central Park's Hans Christian Andersen, or that advanced Cold War agendas, as seen in the 3 equestrian monuments at the entrance plaza of the Avenue of the Americas in Central Park South. So this is a rendering of how it was going to look from 1949, when the Avenue of the Americas is sort of getting going. Moses rarely commissioned work, and in any event, there was little money in city coffers to do it. Jose de Creef's Alice in Wonderland was one exception. The subject of Alice in Wonderland intrigued Moses, who had envisioned a statue to enhance a newly designed plaza next to Central Park's Conservatory Pond. In contrast to the turn of the 20th century, when private organizations often used subscription campaigns to commission monuments, which is a practice now kind of being revived with the monument to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton that will go up in Central Park in the not too distant future. So that approach, where you get a lot of people to give smaller amounts of money, was popular at the turn of the 20th century. In contrast to that approach, Moses preferred to court wealthy individual benefactors. So he convinced publisher Joseph Delacorte to commemorate Delacorte's late wife by endowing the Alice in Wonderland. So it's a memorial. On the whole, however, the city acquired few new civic monuments during the 1950s and early 1960s. During Robert Moses's tenure, it sometimes appeared that the built environment hinged on one man's whims. The fate of municipal sculpture and its patronage underwent notable changes after Moses left office. The confluence of the liberal administrations of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and John Lee Lindsay with the civil rights, feminist, and counterculture movements, and the ascendance of avant-garde art in the 60s, prompted New York City officials to embrace the arts in ways not seen since LaGuardia. The mayoral administration of Republican John V. Lindsay was especially transformative. Lindsay advisors encouraged thinking about culture urbanistically and holistically as a way to renew and preserve cities at a time when middle classes were abandoning them. New York City administrators promoted public sculpture as a way to acknowledge diverse populations. Inspired by the federal public art programs of the General Services Administration and the National Endowment for the Arts, long may they live, and in the context of Lindsay's agenda for urban revitalization, local officials embraced a celebratory, process-oriented approach. Lindsay bureaucrats turned away from the permanent, figurative forms favored by Moses and commissioned temporary outdoor displays of cutting-edge art. Working under Mayor Lindsay, Thomas Hoving and August Heckscher consecutively served as commissioners of parks, recreation, and cultural affairs, which was the name of the super agency that was formed under Lindsay. During Hoving's tenure, which was very, very short, the Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Affairs initiated happenings and placed monumental abstract sculpture, a staple of Soho art galleries, into some of the larger municipal parks. The temporary exhibition, Sculpture in Environment, which went from basically the month of October in 1967, was organized as a demonstration project. And this is the piece that Oldenburg did was he got a bunch of grave diggers. He got permission, which is unusual. He got permission for a bunch of grave diggers to come into Central Park and dig a hole, and then they filled it back up again. So that was, but the exhibition as a whole was considered a kind of experiment. And it was groundbreaking in its scale and ambition, exposing the public to an unprecedented array of new works. My book shows how sculptures, an array of sculptures by the now well-known artists like Alexander Calder, Stephen Antonakos, Crissa, Lyman Kipp, Marisol, Louise Nevelson, Barnett Newman, Claes Oldenburg, George Rickey, Tony Rosenthal, and Tony Smith, among others, were installed on 9 public sites. They were young sculptors at the time, but stuff wasn't new. But they were placed on 9 public sites in New York City parks and in 15 office buildings and outdoor plazas. The majority being in Manhattan, although that wasn't for a want of trying to put them elsewhere. It just got very complicated. This exhibition, along with the subsequent temporary, what was called the Sculpture of the Month series, as you see one here, that was organized by Doris Friedman for Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Affairs beginning in 1967, that increased the public's awareness of abstract art and served as urban revitalization, got people going into the parks. Specific individuals ran with that idea. Officials like Hoving and Heckscher made executive decisions giving rise to new public art opportunities. But it took multiple people to realize those projects. In the late 1960s and onwards, those individuals were increasingly middle management women, working behind the scenes, mainly Doris Friedman, who you see on the left there, Suzanne Randolph, Nancy Rosen, and Margot Wellington, as well as Anita Contini, Jenny Dixon, and Jennifer McGregor. These individuals had kind of populist, optimistic notions of community building through modernist public art and developed new ways of realizing their goals. Friedman was a key force, serving as fundraiser, curator, and as intermediary among artists, neighborhood organizations, city agencies, and art institutions. She established 2 nonprofits, the Public Arts Council and then the Public Art Fund, which actually was sort of the fund for the Public Arts Council when it first got going, and then they kind of merged. And those 2 nonprofits then forged new alliances with the city of New York and generated a range of different projects. In a very late 60s kind of turn, certain projects aimed to cultivate what Friedman described as community self-affirmation. Those were her phrases. And one such enterprise, beginning in 1972, involved collaboration with the Washington Heights Inwood Marble Hill Neighborhood Action Association on a multi-year, what was called the Community Environmental Sculpture Program. A limited competition brought in commissions for minimalist and then conceptual artists like Clement Beadmore and Terry Fugate Wilcox in an effort, and I quote Friedman here, to bring together a community and a group of artists to revitalize a neighborhood in Upper Manhattan, end quote. Sculpture in Gotham discusses all of this in detail and some of the controversies that then ensued with the implementation of this project. But I just want to add that this piece, which is still in situ, is actually, I mean, it looks like a sort of a pole or a minimalist pier, but in fact it's a conceptual work because of, as he describes below, basically there are these layers of aluminum and magnesium, they mix over a period of time of 1,000 years, at which time 3000 AD, the work is considered to be complete. So, you know, a lot of this stuff is conceptual in nature as well as object-oriented. The nonprofit Creative Time, co-founded in the mid-1970s by Anita Contini, thanks to ties with Lindsay officials, focused more on art as economic stimulus, displaying initially craft and gallery art objects as part of an effort to draw people to then in the doldrums lower Manhattan. So this was crafts in action, and this was held inside, but again, they set up and people made their stuff, and workers came around during lunch hour and stuff, and they used the lobbies of some of the buildings that had not yet found tenants. And so that kind of got things going. The late 1970s, early 1980s group installations, Art on the Beach, marked a new phase, extending Creative Time's mission to include cultural as well as economic development. So building up culture in Lower Manhattan as well as trying to kind of revitalize the district as a whole. By the mid-1980s, the organization functioned as a proving ground for innovative approaches to public art patronage, process, sites, and media. Suzanne Randolph, on your left, was involved in multiple areas, evolving from bureaucrat into curator and cultural intermediary in the Parks Department, collaborating with Friedman on a citywide exhibition of Marc de Souvreau's sculptures, coordinating temporary projects for Parks properties, and serving as go-between between the new public-private partnerships, as they came to be called actually a little bit later, that idea. But being a go-between between those kinds of public-private partnerships that sponsored public art, often on city property. Randolph brought a minority presence to cultural administration and successfully championed municipal commissions for African Americans. Now, these women and others behind the scenes realized any number of public sculptural projects, accepting a few of them, like Eduardo Villamizar's Columnar, which you see here, and Tony Rosenthal's Alamo in Astor Place, which you probably all know, as well as 5 and 1 in Manhattan's Police Plaza. That's the first one. I showed you that red one, which was a very challenging project that I discuss at length in my book. But with the exception of those pieces, most of these works were temporary. But in Friedman's view, temporary was not enough. Friedman and lawyer Olga Mahl, and Warhol's portrait's the only thing I could find of her on the web. But Friedman and Mahl, who was with the Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts, they strove to make binding a mechanism for bringing art to communities by commissioning permanent projects for municipal property. Between 1974 and Friedman's untimely incapacitation in 1979, she and Olga Mahl worked with others to develop the Percent for Art legislation, a process I discuss extensively in my book. Passed in 1982 by the City Council, the Mayor, and the New York State Legislature, the law required 1% of the budget for major construction, municipal construction projects to be dedicated to art. In a well-meaning, if baldly political move, the first work to be dedicated under the program was in the largely Puerto Rican neighborhood of East Harlem. The flower-like pink steel sculpture entitled Growth by Puerto Rican artist Jorge Luis Rodriguez had been commissioned not under the auspices of Percent for Art, but rather the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, which managed this actual site, which is now called Art Park. But the priorities of the Koch administration were such that Percent staff and mayoral officials shifted the sculpture's agency affiliation over from HPD to Percent. So it's considered now to be the first Percent for Art project. And is still very much there. It's been repainted, looks great. The Percent for Art law was a political and urban cultural policy milestone. The program's presence is now largely taken for granted, but it should not be. The legislation committed the City of New York to public art sponsorship on a grand scale, highlighted municipal dedication and funneled resources to culture and community, and paved the way for other public art initiatives, including those of the Battery Park City Authority and the New York City Metropolitan Transit Authority, which were influenced by Percent for Art, but they're organizationally different kettles of fish on whose developments my book elaborates a lot. So, by 1982, thanks to forceful advocacy and intervention, public art was poised to become an integral part of the New York City built environment. But what kind of art should this new city art be? Well, the answers would vary from neighborhood to neighborhood. But in Harlem, early on, the answers seemed increasingly clear. When it came to Percent and projects destined for municipal property more generally, the community favored figurative monuments. The city went out of its way to realize them. Beginning in the 1980s in southern Harlem, just adjacent to Central Park, the city commissioned large numbers of agency staff and resources to implement urban revitalization design projects that included bronze hero monuments associated with emancipation and civil rights, most notably Duke Ellington, Frederick Douglass, Ralph Ellison, and Harriet Tubman, who you see here. In Brooklyn's Coney Island, a city-sponsored memorial to Jackie Robinson and Pee Wee Reese was also installed in 2005. Now, there were exceptions to the rule on figuration. In 1976, Suzanne Randolph had collaborated with the Cleveland-based Mildred Andrews Fund to commission Chicago sculptor Richard Hunt's dynamically abstract Harlem hybrid, which is in St. Nicholas, 122nd and near St. Nicholas, dedicated in October 1976. There was also Algernon Miller's 1971 Tree of Hope that was sponsored by the Creative Artists Public Service Program and the Harlem Cultural Council, as well as Growth, which I mentioned before. But the largest and most artistically and logistically complicated commissions proved to be those commemorating Black heroes, figurative monuments that would build on older portrait statue traditions and undercut their fundamental worldviews of Caucasian dominance. The recent works were meant to bolster racial solidarity and serve as affirmations of Harlem as place defined through race, but blackness rather than whiteness. But they too are hero monuments, and I contend are the most notable trends in contemporary public art. They represent the reinvigoration of the traditional bronze civic sculpture at the instigation of minority communities. It's just that nobody in academia ever really thought about them before. Projects projects like the Harriet Tubman, Duke Ellington, and Frederick Douglass were complex. And the latter two, the Ellington and the Douglass, took a very long time. But they represented the city's efforts to atone for previous actions or lack thereof. In sponsoring these works and others, the city was trying to do the right thing for African American residents, especially in Harlem, where predecessors had unsuccessfully attempted to install in 1941 a nude statue by Richmond Barté, whom you see here, that was dedicated to author and activist James Weldon Johnson. In September 1991, the relatively new procedures of the New York City Percent for Art program were seriously tested when artist John Ahern, a resident, I might add a white resident of the South Bronx, installed his sculpture commission for a new 44th Police Precinct building on Jerome Avenue and 169th Street in that borough. Ahern's 3 polychrome bronze statues of local residents of Walton Avenue, which stood very briefly atop simple block pedestals, proved to be so contentious that Ahern removed them after just a few days of unveiling. Audrey Flack's Queen Catherine of Braganza, planned for Long Island City in Queens, also became a casualty of the racially fraught political landscape of early 1990s New York City, when critics charged Catherine and Charles II with having been slaveholders. And I discuss that project also in the book. I discuss all of these. And also Al Sharpton intervened, so we need not say more. The Ellington and Douglass statues, by contrast, represented the city's determination to send a positive message, to concretize associations between Harlem neighborhood and Black identity. This community affirmation agenda was conjoined with a larger area redevelopment enterprise. The Ellington first, and then the Douglass and the Tubman, offered the opportunity to embark on an elaborate improvement of area streets and sidewalks and provide a gateway to Harlem that would stimulate further economic development. The Ellington and Douglass projects took many years, partly for bureaucratic reasons, partly because of the complexity of the infrastructure, but also because of the unprecedented amount of community involvement which city agencies solicited. Many people nowadays, I've learned, people assume that the public, the general public, had a significant say in public sculpture of the past, or should have had in the past, like 19th century, but until recently that was totally not the case. It was rarely the case. In the case of the Ellington, the project had to pass before 2 area community boards whose recommendations could only be advisory. And as many of you probably know, those boards were only created in the late 1960s. With the Frederick Douglass, numerous visioning charrettes, as they were called, workshops, exhibitions, and community discussions took place, and they took forever. But they helped the multiple city agencies involved maintain goodwill by prioritizing community wishes. This was highly unusual. With the Harriet Tubman, less community involvement produced a bit of grumbling at the end of the process for various reasons I discuss. All of the statues had to be, and not just the statues, but the entire complex had to be approved by the city's art commission, and sometimes the art commission didn't want to touch the approval of the sculpture part until the whole had been finished. And when you get DOT, the Department of Transportation involved, you have subways running underneath, electrical systems, it gets complicated. So it took forever. But, you know, the agencies prioritized community involvement and community wishes. And that was important. all of the statues, so I mentioned the Art Commission. The Art Commission was established in 1898. New York was a very different place back then. It was written into the charter that this body would serve as an impartial vetting for projects that would be on city property. And it was notoriously demanding in its earliest years. They would just say no if they didn't like it, and that was that. By the year 2000, the Art Commission had far less power, but it still had enough to hold things up. The Ellington was the first of the monuments to be completed in 1997. It was begun in 1979. It was initiated by cabaret singer Bobby Short. Without this celebrity sponsoring it, this monument, with its stiff columnar Ellington standing next to a piano atop tall columns with, which you can see in the bottom slide there, the columns which had what came to be very controversial naked African-American caryatid figures, so they're holding up the piano. That would never have been approved without Short's involvement, but it was, and my book tells that story. With the Douglas, both the artist who designed the plaza and the sculptor encountered obstacles. The regal Douglas statue by Hungarian-born Gabriel Koren is the closest thing to a 19th century bronze, but the community insisted that it face north, or the North Star, over the sculptor's vehement protests. Consequently, Douglas's face is in shadow a lot of the time. The Frederick Douglass Plaza followed the approach specified in what was called the design concept, which was worked out, this larger concept, which had been worked out with residents and others involved in these visioning charrettes. Artist and Harlem resident Algernon Miller created a program based on a quilt pattern, an early design of which you see here. And that quilt pattern was influenced by a popular book called Hidden in Plain View, about the Underground Railroad. The problem was that academic historians, who included Frederick Douglass scholar David Blight, argued that the arguments in this particular book were a myth, and that Miller's scheme was thus historically false. And in fact, the Art Commission had, in an early stage, had told the team that they needed to consult with historian experts, and they did consult with one eminent curator, but not with academic historians, say like Blight or Foner, Eric Foner. Yeah. So Miller, the artist, had insisted that the book he used was history, and the supervising agencies allowed him to move ahead with this conception. Their response to a subsequent New York Times article, which reported this story, this controversy, was that the Frederick Douglass Memorial was about art, not about history. The Art Commission insisted upon some modifications to the quilt patterns. Basically, they couldn't be akin to what was illustrated in the book, but officials like New York City Commissioner of Cultural Affairs Kate Levin prioritized community desires here. And the community, some of whom wanted myth and most who wanted site improvements, was fine with that. Alison Saar's Harriet Tubman, with its monumental scale, low pedestal, trailing roots, and polychromy coloring, is the least naturalistic figurative sculpture of the three. Tubman strides resolutely toward the south, without the emblem of the rifle, with which she's associated, however, which officials in the selection panel did not permit to have the rifle. Southern orientation made sense here because it was at the apex of that triangle that was already there, but it angered some who, as with the Douglas, were invested in the symbolism of the statue facing north toward freedom and the North Star. In this case, the work had already been dedicated when those objections arose and no changes were made. In the end, however, the Ellison, the Douglas, and the Tubman fulfilled dreams left unfinished with the James Weldon Johnson and other visions. African Americans were now the ones who stood on pedestals. Their monuments became urban landmarks. The Department of Transportation widened the streets, mostly to help traffic, but also to enable the monuments to serve as an endpoint to a vista and as a physical draw to pedestrians. All were cast in bronze. Each artist sought to portray the subjects as embodiments of the real and the ideal, and as expressions of a grand civic vision. The state, here being the city of New York, perpetuated the older European tradition of serving as public art patron. New York may be a center of the avant-garde and contemporary art, but some of its most important contributions to late 20th century and early 21st century art will be remembered aesthetically, if not ideologically, as conservative and retrospective. The complexity of the processes I've mapped out here superficially, but which my book discusses at great length, demonstrate vividly why completion of public art projects was not a foregone conclusion, how much forethought and dedication the processes entailed, and just how much of an achievement those successful outcomes were. They actually got them done. Nothing should be taken for granted about that. And that story of negotiation, major negotiation, and its significance is what my book is all about. So I thank you so much, and I don't know if there's time for questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi. So thanks for a great talk.
Thank you.
I was just up at Storm King this past weekend, and I saw that endless column. It's up there, red. The endless column.
Oh, yeah?
Is there.
Oh,
yeah,
great.
it's got a great picture if you want to see it. And I saw the man with the dog sculpture at Socrates Park not so long ago, maybe within the last 18 months.
Yes.
But I have two questions.
Yeah.
The statue of Seward that sits in Madison Square Park has several stories about it, having to do with the committee that paid for the head running out of money, and then Randolph Rogers, the sculptor, having taken one of his other statues and maybe did a little switcheroo with a Lincoln, and the Emancipation Proclamation turns into the deed for Alaska. Do you have any views on that particular story?
I am not familiar with that particular story because that's one of the few sculptures that I actually haven't studied in depth, I'm afraid.
Okay, so then let me ask you another question. If you had to name the largest statue, artwork, or sculpture in New York City, what would be your
The
number?
largest?
The largest statue, artwork, sculpture.
Well, I mean, off the top of my head, I have to say Civic Virtue, which is the one I showed at the beginning, simply because that's the one I've obsessed over for 30 years or something, on and off. But there probably are, I mean, the 5 and 1 by Tony Rosenthal is pretty large, the one in Police Plaza. And that's one of the reasons it had so many there were a lot of technical problems. A very interesting story. But I don't know, off the top of my head.
I'm putting you in a bind now, I'm sorry. Just, but by the way, the statue on top of Center Street, 1 Center Street, all the way up top.
Yeah, Civic Fame.
Yeah, that's pretty big. And
It
somebody
is.
once said, well, that's the biggest statue. And I said, what about the Statue of Liberty? That's pretty big too.
That's, yes, that's
Okay.
probably the biggest.
And the artwork, I'm thinking where that bank is in that sunken area with that big black and white sculpture.
Dubuffet.
Yeah.
Down.
And there's a Noguchi.
Right,
Yes,
There's a
right,
Noguchi
right.
and Noguchi down
Yes.
Yeah, and where is the base of the Farragut statue these days?
The base,
In other words,
yeah, so the Farragut is the monument that is in Madison Square, north, and that was, in the 1930s, under Moses actually in LaGuardia, they got sculptors to fix, the monuments in the city were a mess. They hadn't been maintained and the way they are now. And so they got artists to fix the works and sometimes recarve. And I believe that base which was originally bluestone, was recarved, and I seem to recall it's up in the St. Gaudens Historic Site in New Hampshire, but I'm not positive.
New England, I'm sure.
Any other? Yes, sir.
You said the art commission, what is it called?
It's called the Public Design Commission now.
Public design?
Yeah.
And it's still at the top of the city hall?
Yes.
In the roof?
Yeah, they're on the 3rd floor of City
Yeah, I
Hall.
had to go when I was at City Plan,
Aha,
present there,
yeah,
bring the boards and
they're
it's a
still
nice
there.
hike
Yeah,
up into the attic.
yes. So they still do their thing.
Yeah.
In the back, and then,
So I was wondering, who tells us about why Abraham removed the Harlem sculptures from the police precinct plaza?
yeah, they were actually in the Bronx. The Ahern ones were put up in the Bronx.
In the Bronx.
And they were commissioned as a Percent for Art project when the police precinct building was built, so it was one of those 1%. And it actually is the subject of someone named Jane Kramer wrote a wonderful book called Whose Art Is It? And she discusses the whole thing. I discuss a little of it, although the end part of it is sort of interesting that she doesn't talk about. But he basically was thrown for a loop when someone from the DDC, it was DDC, Department of Design and Construction, and another person were doing a site visit of the area to see this project, and were taken aback by the sculptures. And then a member of the community, Mrs. Salgado, decided that she was offended by the works. Both groups basically felt that Ahern was, we can go back to show you which one it is. Oop. Yeah, so Ahern depicted some of his neighbors, three figures. Raymond with his pit bull, Corey, a big burly guy with a basketball, and he's got his foot on a boombox, and a young girl, Delisha, wearing roller skates. And basically, Mrs. Delgado argued that these did not represent the community in the way that the community wanted to be represented. That he was showing them, I'm going blank on my language here, but the kind of guys who wouldn't want to run across in a dark alley, and they were troublemakers. Corey was a troublemaker, and so they wanted to be represented in a more positive way. And there were other issues having to do with the fact that Ahern was white, and some people argued that he had the privilege of coming and living in the South Bronx, whereas most of the other people up there did not have the privilege of making making that choice, and that they could go back downtown if they, if he wanted to. So they presented him as being a kind of interloper, even though he was a longtime resident of the neighborhood. So there were multiple issues that sort of centered around race and class. But Ahern, because he lived there, and all of his art, or I should say a lot of his art, had to do with making plaster casts of the kids in the neighborhood and putting them up on sides of buildings and stuff. So he was really upset that this had happened, and he basically said, I'll forego my last payment, and I want this removed. So then, interestingly, and Kramer doesn't talk about this, but the head of Percent for Art at that time was Tom Finkelpearl, who is now the head of Cultural Affairs, and who is wielding a lot of power in public art in his own particular way. Now, and so Finkelpearl tried to actually go to foundations to see if they could get money to sponsor those sculptures someplace else, and they were turned down. So then the city ended up with the sculptures, and so that's how they got, they get put up in Socrates Sculpture Park, which is now a city park. At that time, it was not a city park. So it was a very upsetting, complicated situation where everyone, was well-meaning and heartfelt, but in the end, Ahern wanted to defer to what he felt were community sentiment. Although living in New York, you can also wonder whether if it had stayed up longer, whether that would have stayed the same, and whether other people might have felt that, why should one person speak for the entire community and things like that. So it's complicated.
Where are they now?
I don't know where they are now. Sometimes they're in Socrates Sculpture Park, but I don't know if they're actually up
And where
there
is
now.
it?
Oh, Socrates Sculpture Park is in Queens,
that's all,
in Long Island City.
Yeah,
That's
right
right,
opposite
near
the
Middle
Costco,
School.
right opposite, yeah.
Yeah.
You had a question?
I just wondered, is Louise Nevelson's sculpture, the three of them opposite the Fed, considered large? I came late, so I didn't.
Yes,
see
those
it.
are very large. And those were recently conserved. Very complicated process once again. And, what I can't stress enough is how hard the agencies and the people who work in those agencies work to bring these things to the public and, to keep them maintained. And so when, sometimes when you hear, like today, about the city in the past wasn't doing this or wasn't doing that, to some extent, I want to argue that this is a corrective to that kind of argument. Something I'm emphasizing. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to ask if you had any comment about, there was maybe a couple of months ago, or maybe it was a year ago, with the sunbather in Long Island City. There was all this talk about changing the Percent for Art law, and I think Jimmy Van Brainward started talking about more control from the council. Do you have any comment about that? I'm not sure what happened to that actually.
Yeah, I forget what okay, so I think I don't know that Percent for Art was supposed to be changed, or whether it was that they wanted the process where it went to public design review, the art commission, to be changed. Because typically, the bottleneck in that process occurs less with although I can see how the percent process might be an issue. I can come back to that. But so where councilmen get upset is when the art commission either turns something down, or usually they send it back. They don't turn it down. They make you do changes for things. And councilmen don't, their focus is political and not aesthetic. The focus of the art commission is aesthetic. So the councilmen get upset when something in their hood is turned, sent back, and then they say we want to change the law. And my recollection was there was talk about changing the charter, which now there's a new charter commission, so who knows, but that Van Bramer, who is a very strong advocate for the arts, also he kind of intervened in the controversy about that particular sculpture, which looks like a kind of pink Gumby. It's very, that's the only way to give you a picture. It's a pink, and it's got very little detail on it, and it's sort of a reclining figure. And so when people first saw the drawings of it and stuff, they said, what is this thing? And so there was all this upset. Now it's coming back to me about that work. And so what Van Bramer did, which I wholeheartedly approve of, and working with the Percent for Art people, was that they arranged for community discussion. And what Percent for Art does and has for some time since the Ahern problem has tried to do is, vet things with the community before they actually get finished, and basically to develop a process of education, art education. The problem is that lacking funding, that process doesn't always take place. And one of the things with this work was that the Percent people, the staff said, were very, very upset when the controversy arose over this. And they said, they had no funding at that point. They couldn't do any kind of educational outreach. But over time, they kind of have built that into the process. So anything that happens, certainly from here on in, that's going to happen. So I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Can I just say that because it's starting to get hot in here, not because of the topic so much as the weather outside, and there seem to be really a lot of questions of individual interest, that we take the opportunity of the reception to ask Michele those particular questions, and we thank her for really terrific and if it starts to get too hot, you can double use the postcard for our new exhibition as a fan to keep the air moving around in here. So let me pass them out as I say, welcome. I know there's some people here for the first time, right? So yes, welcome. So in that case, you don't know that I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the museum. And we have an authors talk series that we hold once a month on topics that range pretty widely, but are focused on skyscrapers, New York City, international building and urbanism, and wide topics on the past, present, and future of the skyscraper. And especially of New York, and that keys into our exhibition Skyline, which is in its final touch stages, because we're actually having the members reception tomorrow night, and there's still a few labels to write that hopefully will all be in place by tomorrow at 6 o'clock. So if you are a member, you've already been invited to that reception, and I hope that you will want to become a member, so that when you hear about, you'll have a chance to hear about all of our exciting programs and the benefits of membership. So I encourage you to do that, those of you who are seeing us here for the first time. This exhibition, I'm spending a moment or two for people who maybe still be coming in from the rain, looks at a topic that is surprising that we haven't addressed before, because we've been doing exhibitions for 20 years now, since our first show on Wall Street back in 1997. It was really going on 21 years. And it's such an obvious subject to tackle, the history of New York in its collective skyscraper imagery, in its brand identity, which is really as a skyscraper city and its skyline. So I hope that after the talk, when we have a reception and you can get a book and have Michele sign it, that you'll also take an opportunity to look around and get, the preview of the mostly finished Skyline exhibition, and then come back for other talks that will kind of explore the themes. So we're nicely embedded in New York City and in the recent history of New York City in Michele Bogart's book, Sculpture in Gotham. What else? Art and Urban Renewal in New York City. And Michele Bogart is a good friend of long-standing, as we like to say when we begin to get at a point we don't like to talk about old friends anymore. So, but I've known her for a very long time. Being in the world of art history and academic art history, we were just talking about, we really go way back to conferences that were held in different parts of the Northeast and all this, and Chicago, and schlepping around in order to see cities. And Michele has an appetite for understanding cities. She wrote her first published book, which was on civic art, and in order to get the title correct, I'll read it here: Public Sculpture and the Civic Ideal in New York City, 1890 to 1930. Was her first kind of young academic masterwork, and since then she's been exploring, as in this book, the idea of public art and sculpture in the public realm, as well as other topics that have to do with kind of the promotion of art, including artists, advertising, and the borders of art. So this book is close to her heart because she, in addition to being an academic interested in this topic, she also served on the art commission, now called the Public Design Commission, for how many years? 4 years. In the midst of what is always a part of their bailiwick, which is bureaucracy plus controversy together. And she's got her opinions on some of the things, the issues that have been raised recently about civic sculpture. But when was there ever more controversy than during the time of urban renewal, at least as we look back on it today? So I'm looking forward to seeing her slides and getting a sense of her read on the shape of this public sculpture. So in order to give her more time, in order to talk, Michele, I forgot to say that you are a professor at Stony Brook and in the art history department and has had many students over the years who have had great success. The students came to see her talk tonight. So that's also an important part of how she extends her scholarship into the broader world.